Senator Kim, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the world was watching and bracing for this moment. And so now here we are. The United States and Israel have launched this military attack against Iran. Based on my conversations, Senator Lindsey Graham, for example, saying he is bracing for this to be a military operation that lasts for days and potentially weeks. What is your reaction to what has unfolded so far?
Well, this is an appalling action by this president, and to see something like this that goes so clearly against the will and the desire of the American people is something that should be shocking for all of us. Trump is trying to normalize his ability to be able to take military action anywhere in the world and to be able to just actively and publicly flaunt his efforts against the Constitution of the United States. This is something that we need to stand up against, and I believe that we need to have Congress reassemble as soon as possible this weekend to be able to vote on the War Powers resolution to show that this is not something that the American people want.
Well, I want to get to Congress's role in just a moment, but what are your biggest concerns, Senator?
Well, I worked on issues in the Middle East when I worked at the Pentagon. I was 15 years ago in Afghanistan as a civilian embedded with the military. I've seen with my own eyes the problems that arise and the tragedy that ensues when our country goes into war. And that's Trump's word. He said it's a war without strategy, without proper consideration of what the American people want. This is a protracted, open-ended conflict that Trump just started with the objective of regime change. This is giving us nightmares and flashbacks to 2003 Iraq War, and we saw where that led us with the lives lost and so much resource wasted. This is something that right now more than ever, when I did a town hall, I asked people there, who here wants to see U.S. military action against Iran? No hands were raised. I asked who here believes that the American people's voice needs to be heard if this moves forward. Every hand was raised. The president is so far out of touch with the American people, and I worry that this is going to be something where it's our service members that bear the brunt of it, not Donald Trump, and that's something that we have to make sure we're holding accountable.
Well, you and others are calling for Congress to come back for a vote on the War Powers resolution. President Trump, though, argued there was an imminent threat that required the United States to take this action. You heard him lay out the case in his State of the Union address, effectively saying that Iran's trying to develop a weapon that could ultimately hit the United States. Does the president need to have the authority to be able to act if there is an imminent threat that he perceives?
I'm on the Homeland Security Committee. There has been no notification to us of any imminent threat. What we see just with this president is he's willing to say anything to be able to just justify his actions. Just last year, he said that the Iranian threat was obliterated. He said that they were decimated by his actions, and now we're hearing something completely different. If there was such an imminent threat, why didn't we engage in further diplomatic efforts beyond what we saw? Right now, what we had was Witkoff and Kushner engaged in these just a handful of talks. Meanwhile, they're also the same diplomatic team that's in charge of Russia and Ukraine, on Israel, Palestine, and the greater Middle East peace. I mean, if this was so important, don't send a part-time diplomatic operation forward and then say that it failed after a couple of days and then move forward on these unprecedented strikes without congressional approval. Again, this is not just about concern over which branch of government's engaging. This is about actively going against the will of the American people, and that is something that he needs to be held accountable for.
Do you believe that there would be enough support to pass the War Powers resolution? Republicans control both chambers of Congress, Senator.
Well, look, being there at the State of the Union last week, there is certainly real concern about how this Republican leadership and the Republican-led Congress is just doing whatever Trump's bidding is. I've often said it doesn't feel like we have three branches of government anymore, as we have just one branch of government trying to dominate the other two. That being said, we should be on the record And the American people deserve to hear what their representatives believe and whether or not they support what I believe is an illegal, unconstitutional war. And again, war was the word that Trump used. He is actively saying we are at war with these major combat operations, looking for regime change. Is that really something that the American people are waking up today and saying that is the priority of America? Absolutely not. They're worried about affordability. They're worried about high costs. They're worried about our own communities, not about Trump asserting himself in this way as an imperialist president.
Senator, let me ask you about the broader argument that Iran poses a threat to the United States. It has been called a state sponsor of terror. What do you make of the fact that in these negotiations, according to administration officials, Iran was not negotiating in good faith, was not saying, as the president argued, the magic words that it would in fact abandon its nuclear weapons program? Does that not concern you, putting aside the idea of congressional authority? Do you not think that Iran needs to be defanged in that way?
I worked for years trying to counter Iranian terror in the region, so I know this firsthand, and I certainly take that threat seriously. But that doesn't give, and I think this is important for the American people to understand, just because they are named a terror group does not give Trump the authorization. Even after September 11th, we needed congressional authorization to be able to use force against a terror group that we had identified. We also identify North Korea as a state sponsor of terror. Does that mean that Donald Trump can unleash on his own an area assault of this magnitude against North Korea? We know and understand that is not something that one person in this country of 330 million people is able to do, and especially when it puts service members in harm's way. If we enter into a conflict without strategy, we saw where that led. It led to decades of problems, as we saw in Afghanistan, lives lost, thousands of lives lost. And after that, I can't imagine any American would want to see us push forward in this way without strategy, without the resources dedicated to our service members. And so I feel very strongly about this. Yes, they are a threat, but if that's the case, then put the entirety of America unified together against it with a strategy. But again, that is not what Trump's pushing. And right now, the American people do not buy and do not support what this president is doing.
Senator, let me ask you about the overall goal. The president said that the operation ultimately is for regime change. Just bottom line, do you support regime change in Iran?
I do not support this president's actions in trying to unilaterally do that. I think that is up to the Iranian people, and we have seen full force what can happen in these types of circumstances. Again, I was in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen these efforts of America trying to impose regime change on their own, and the backlash as well as the result of it. This is a circumstance, when you look at it very clearly, where, for instance, the IRGC Quds Force could very well use this as an opportunity to seize control, putting the power in even more dangerous hands than what we see right now. So, this is something where the president can't just take strikes and then cross his fingers that things are going to work out. Lives are on the line. And if he's fomenting this type of popular uprising, what is he going to do? What is this president going to do if we see another massacre of Iranian protesters as we saw earlier this year? Is that going to just further and prolong American involvement? And to what end? I see no way in which this president has thought through how we exit this type of war that he has started.
Well, let me ask you, because the administration is arguing, look, it can bring about regime change without putting U.S. boots on the ground. Do you think that's realistic? Do you think that it's possible to bring about regime change? You heard the president's message today to the people of Iran that it's their moment to rise up once the bombs stop falling and to bring about regime change on their own. Do you think that that is a possibility? I understand that you're opposed to this operation writ large, but I'm asking you about whether you think it's possible that, in fact, this could be carried out without U.S. boots on the ground.
Well, we saw with the Maduro operation, this president has forced regime change, and certainly with strikes against leadership in Iran, it could very well, just by virtue of the strikes and targeting, could create an opening there. But again, To what end? Will it actually bring about a regime that is going to be better for the security of America? Can we assure that? Can this president look us in the eye, the American people, and say, I can guarantee that whatever regime does come in or leader come in, that that was better for the United States? He cannot, in good faith, make that guarantee to the American people. And I have just seen too much of hubris in White Houses of past, and this one in particular, that thinks that they can just dictate and control situations all over the world. And often what happens is that it's the American service members, our military, that pays the price for the hubris of an American president. And I worry that that is something that this president is doing. And without Congress engaged in this, I believe that we are abdicating our responsibility. And I urge yet again that we convene immediately to be able to take up the voice of the American people and bring that into this conversation, because that is what is missing. I've heard a lot from Trump, but he needs to hear from Americans.
Let me ask you, if the president makes his case to Congress, to the American people, is there a universe where you could support this operation if it were to come up for a vote, Senator?
Well, look, it's too late for that. You know, this is a situation where he has already undertaken an unconstitutional war. And again, war is his term. And so this is something where I am going to do everything I can to try to get, Americans that are in harm's way right now out of it, to try to do my best in the same way that I have in the past. Even though I didn't support the 2003 Iraq war, I tried my best to be able to try to temper the circumstance and create the best scenario for American security. It is difficult, though, when the president has unleashed Pandora's box. We know that things are now happening that are irreversible. So the question is, what comes next? I will work diligently to try to fight for the security of service members and the American people, as I have my whole career.
All right, Senator Andy Kim, thank you so much for being with us, giving us your perspective this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.